All right, so good morning. Thank you guys for joining the meeting and hope you had a good weekend. I will say about mine, part of the reason that I have not graded a single thing you turned in, so sorry about that, is that I was at a conference I left for on Thursday and then got home Monday around noon. So goodness. And it was really, really busy, much more so than I anticipated. So, and I've been to this meeting before. It was never like this. So we just had more stuff to do than we normally do. So apologies. And I'll try to slowly catch up on the grading. Wednesday and Friday will probably be grading days for me. We also need to talk a little bit about what you guys want to do as far as due dates for stuff. Right now, you currently have 2 questions officially due on Friday, which are, we may want to change it. We may not want to change it. I will also tell you that if you're turning in stuff a little bit late, it's not going to be the end of the world. I'm not going to dock points, that kind of stuff, till we get caught up. I think the thing we probably want to discuss, and honestly, we can discuss this on Thursday, sorry. But if you can think about it until then, is if you want to do the quiz by next Friday, which I kind of think is a good idea because I don't think most people will spend their time studying over spring break, but I could be wrong about that. And I'm not sure that I want to do it, when you get back. And I really am pretty sure I don't want to make it due during spring break because, I think that would be bad. And if you want to extend the due date on the weekly questions through spring break, I wouldn't mind. I don't know if that helps you, hurts you, puts more pressure on you, that sort of thing. So the 2 questions to think about. Do you want to extend the due date for questions through like the Monday after spring break for those last 2 questions, or at least the last one, maybe the last one? I don't want to make you even more of a procrastinator than you already are. So we could extend the due date on the last question for the unit to, excuse me for the yawn. I'm so sorry. Whew, sorry. To the Monday right after spring break, or we could put both of them on the 12th, I think. The last 2 questions on the 12th. All right, you think about that. And you can also think about the extending the due date on the quiz. I'm just not really sold on that. I don't think it's a good idea, but if you could talk me into it, might happen. Also, I'm going to remind you that in my neighborhood, Tuesday is trash day because I think you're about to hear some noise. That's the only reason I'm reminding you. All right. So your weekly questions, excuse me for the yawn. Oh my goodness. I think I probably get about 4 hours sleep every night of that conference. I'm too old for that. I'm just saying. All right. The weekly questions. So we're thinking about how do women react to the language of freedom and liberty. Be sure to include your response. In your response, Abigail Adams' opinions appear in Voices of Freedom, and how did the framers of the Constitution balance the competing claims of local self-government, sectional interests, and national authority. So those are 2 weekly questions. We'll try to think about women and liberty a little bit today. We may talk about it a little bit more next time, although we'll try to get to it today. All right, and we'll look at the notes. Do you hear the trash truck? It's so loud. All right, let me grab my book too, because it will help with my slightly sketchy notes. I really thought I was going to have time at my conference to kind of look over notes and that sort of thing. Crud, I didn't even know. It was not it. I know you can read that. Let me see if I can make that a little bigger. Maybe you can read it. You're young. I can't read. All right. So I think we are talking about chapter 6. I feel like we are. So let's kind of go through this. Remember, our notes are a little sketchy here. Sorry. Chapter 6. So you may want to actually add to this as we go along. Just a thought. Also, textbook, also useful. So make sure you look that over. On the book, this chapter opens up with a discussion of Abigail Adams. And I think one of the peculiar things about the Adams family, not the ones in the weird movies, but John and Abigail, excuse me, and the cousin Samuel and the extended Adams family, which is pretty prominent in Massachusetts politics and political philosophy and life in general for a long time. And I think there's still some Adams family members that are involved in Massachusetts politics on a state level. They understood that they were public figures. So when they wrote letters to each other, John and Abigail, they understood that those letters would become part of the historical record. So they probably had a weird idea that somewhere, several hundred years later, somebody's history class would be talking about their letters because they knew that they were part of an important historical movement. Mr. Adams understood that he was an important actor in that movement, and Mrs. Adams also as well understood. So the letters that they exchanged to each other, normally letters are considered private, so they're a different sort of primary source, but these are different sort of primary source. When I'm talking primary source, it's that direct information from actors within history. So, they're talking about what they see to each other, and diary type or letter type public sources usually are seen as really, really reliable sources because they are private. So you get people's actual personal feelings and maybe some secrets in there as well. I am not suggesting to you that these letters are not reliable sources. They certainly are. Excuse me. However, she understood, both the Adams, John and Abigail understood that these would become part of the public record. So they're not going to have secrets in them, is what I'm saying. There's not going to be like, did you see what Alexander Hamilton was wearing the other day? Or did you hear Thomas Jefferson talking about himself again? Can we ever, although Jefferson probably is less likely to do that. But there's not going to be a little snide comments or anything like that and any secret stuff. And they also know they're for public consumption. So they know that you're reading their letters. So they're going to talk about stuff that they think is important that should be discussed historically. Also, unusual things about Abigail Adams, her father was a minister and thought that women should be as well educated as men. So she had an unusually strong education. I'm not going to say for a woman, I'm going to say for anyone during this time period, because most people didn't go to school for very long. Even, in Massachusetts, they at least wanted them to read the Bible. And I know, it's more secular by this time period, but Massachusetts is going to be the place with public schools. So at least everybody's got functional literacy in Massachusetts because they got to go to school until they did. But she has something much broader than that. She studied the classics, she's read Shakespeare, probably studied Latin. So she is incredibly well educated for anyone during this time period. And most people who study the Adams would note that she is the intellectual equal of her husband in many ways, even though he had the legal training that she didn't have. But she's a very powerfully intelligent woman. And their writing back and forth to each other talks about what they thought needed to be included in the new government. And Mrs. Adams was really comfortable sharing what she thought about it. And she especially talked about how it was time to end slavery, which is a more common feeling in places like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania than perhaps other colonies because of that religious background. even though I know that Adams and the Adams family isn't particularly Puritan, but they've got that heritage. And she's also going to be concerned about how women, indentured servants, Native Americans, poor people really are stripped of, or not stripped of their rights, just never given their rights. So if the struggle with England or Britain is about equality and about granting people equality who felt like they didn't earn it, or excuse me, they didn't receive it, making sure that they get it, then why not extend that in the American Revolution to women, to Native Americans, to slaves, to former indentured servants, to make it easier for people to have voting rights, whether they own property or not, that sort of thing. Now, legally in this era, men had absolute power over their wives. So the husband kind of could literally rule the house. I'm not going to suggest to you that most men went around saying like, I own you, you know, that sort of thing. I don't know that that's necessarily the way that people viewed the marriage relationship. But women couldn't own property, women couldn't make legal decisions, so they didn't have any legal rights. And what Abigail Adams is starting to discuss is how it's time for women to have some of those. And there is some discussion in there as well that this push for liberty among everybody is really kind of, it's a new thing because it's going to cause upheaval in the social order. So I think they rightly understood that. I think they've probably differed on their opinion whether that was a good thing or not. The most famous part of one of the letters is Abigail Adams' Remember the Ladies letter, where he said, you know, when you are drawing up the Constitution, remember the ladies, be sure to give them rights, give them the ability to vote, that sort of thing. And his response was essentially, women already rule the world because they control their husbands. And while I'm sure that men would like to joke about that during that era, and in some ways, certainly women had influence, and husbands understood that being disrespectful to your wife or unkind to her is not going to be good at the house. It doesn't mean she got to go out and make a proper decision or place a vote. So, and the Voices of Freedom thing on page 248, be sure and look over that, and it may help you as you start to discuss the question about women. Okay, so let's get back to perhaps the information in the chapter. So the idea of equality seems to be based on, do you get to vote and what natural rights do you have? I don't think there are very many people during this era who thought that human beings didn't have some natural rights, even if they differed on what those rights were, if those rights were equal, that sort of thing. But the thought was, among most of the ruling class, that if you didn't own property, then you not having the right to vote was okay because you didn't have a stake in society. So you are created equal and you have the right to certainly exist, be treated reasonably well. You may not deserve the right to vote. And if you are of different ethnic or racial heritage, there's going to be lots of differing ideas whether you deserve the right for freedom, whether you're fully equal to people who are white, that sort of thing. And that'll be an ongoing discussion that happens before the revolution, during the revolution, during the writing of the Constitution, after the revolution, and of course, you know, continues today about how do we correct some wrongs from the past. So when the Founding Fathers are talking about freedom, in this era, they might be talking about equality for all white men. That's probably the expansion of equality during this era. And you're thinking, well, that's not very broad. Well, for the time period, oddly enough, it is. So in England, people who didn't own property were not able to vote. So the fact that you could potentially vote in America if you couldn't own property seemed to be an expansion of liberty. And you will see that happen. Now, I know that the discussion at first is, do we let the folks vote if they own property or not, because they have the stake in the advancement of society if they own stuff, and not so much if they don't. But you know that the eventual decision was you didn't need to own property. One thing you will notice is people who didn't own property probably are not going to be more involved in the government than voting, because they have to work. So, and being involved in the local government takes time. All right, so Thomas Paine, they talk about him a little bit, and his view of equality is going to be a little different because he's not as wealthy and not a slave owner. And he also eventually kind of gets kicked out of the United States, which is interesting because he's the common sense fellow. Yeah, so it seems odd that somebody who writes such an important early document is going to not be very highly favored at a certain point in US history, but that's coming as well. All right, so the book talks about how in this era, the discussion of democracy really isn't a good, warm, fuzzy sort of idea. It's really sort of chaotic. So the idea of democracy is not something that people want. They don't really want everybody shouting their opinions all at once. They don't want rule by the masses and rule in every way by popular vote, because then you could have tyranny of the majority. Sometimes the masses are led astray. There could be a popular idea that is not good for the country, but it gains popularity because, sometimes trends do that. So they wanted the voice of the people to be heard, but they also wanted it to be filtered in some ways as well. So one of the things that they start to talk about is the difference in the state constitutions in that time period. Because of the impact of George III and people not being big fans because they thought he was a tyrannical leader, you remember Declaration of Independence, big list of stuff we hate about George III. Sorry, quick water break. They wanted state governments. So state governments create, state constitutions create state governments that often have a very weak governor system because they're afraid of the influence of a more tyrannical leader. I'm just peeking at the book to make sure that I don't leave out something crucially important here. And the more conservative folks, again, really wanted property ownership to be part of the requirement to vote. Others did not want it to be part of the requirement to vote. Most states probably had some requirement, maybe some sort of tax-paying requirement, typically, which is a reflection of you owning property before you could vote. It was probably a much lesser requirement, and of course, in the American colonies, now the United States, it's much easier to obtain property than it would have been in England. However, most states don't have what we think of as universal suffrage for white men, just the idea that all white guys could vote. There's some states where they might let people of color vote as well if they owned property, and there are a few states where they just let everybody vote. But as a rule, most of the states either had some sort of property or tax-paying requirements for people getting to vote. They also were concerned that the governor would have too much power. So most states either had a very limited governor. What am I trying to say? They had very much limited the powers of the governor, kind of like we do here in Texas, and created legislatures that didn't necessarily rely on the dominance of wealthy men. So two house legislatures were pretty trendy or pretty popular. sometimes the state allowed the governor to have a veto power. And then there might be a way for the legislature to override that veto. So you see stuff that sort of lends itself to what we end up with in the US government. But the weaker governor model is really a reaction to concerns about tyranny of leaders like George III. Oh, I am so sorry. Goodness. All right. If you're wondering, like, which colonies or states, excuse me, at this point, are going to have the most egalitarian constitutions, the one where most people are equal, you should always expect that answer to be Pennsylvania, because it's got that Quaker background. And even though it's not dominated by Quakers at this point, certainly that heritage still remains. So you see the more democratic governments probably in the colonies that start with the religious heritages. So we're talking Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. I know that's sometimes surprising as well, especially the Massachusetts part, but both of these states are less likely to have people who want slavery. And they also, because people live longer in these colonies, they're more likely to have women who own property, because often women who own property are widows. Yeah, so you got to live a while to be one of those in that era, especially. All right. And as far as religious toleration, yeah, during this time period, religious toleration probably means we put up with pretty much any type of Christian. The exception might be Catholics. People are kind of not excited about the Catholic Church during this time period for a couple of reasons. It's associated with Spain, which is seen as, old school, tyrannical, ruled by the royal family without much input from their parliament, legislature, and also because you remember reading about the Quebec Act in the Revolution chapter. People saw the ability to go to the Catholic Church kind of as associated with this idea of popery, which is not potpourri, but being led by one single leader who could eventually become a tyrant and maybe could exploit his followers to obey the church more than they would obey the federal law. So people were concerned about the influence of the Pope. So in the United States, especially East Coast, the Catholic Church was kind of looked down on as an antiquated church, a relic where you follow some tyrannical leader, the Pope, and all of the followers of the Catholic Church would do whatever the Pope said, and they would value the church and the Pope more than they would value the law of their country. So people were concerned about Catholics, and there was an anti-Catholic bias. And, again, probably the only place that you might get around a little bit of that, Pennsylvania, not Massachusetts. Pennsylvania, maybe a little, maybe. I know we've probably talked about religion more than you want to in this class, but the different religious groups didn't always get along, and they didn't always trust each other. And they usually were composed of people from specific ethnic backgrounds, and it's kind of built into those ethnic groups not liking each other. So the book talks about how most people from England proper, with the exception of the Puritans, were members of the Church of England, or what becomes in the Americas the Anglican Church. And typically wealthier people were members of that church. And it's a religious thing, but it's also a socioeconomic thing as well. Scots-Irish people, and this is the combo of those folks that were sent over to Ireland to kind of control the Catholics and get them in line. And they're not highly favored by Catholics because, they controlled Ireland and repressed Catholics, but they're also not highly favored by Anglicans because, wealthier people in England, because they're seen as lesser because those folks left to go to Ireland because it was going to be an opportunity to own land. I mean, it's going to be in a hostile environment, but they weren't going to get to own land if they stayed in England proper. So Scots Irish are they're kind of seen as renegades a little bit too. They tend to live more on the frontier. They want to be away from established authority. These guys tend to be Presbyterian. So, and that seems to be linked to the Scots-Irish kind of heritage. You know that Irish folks tend to be Catholic, and they're going to be different theological concerns that these groups will have about each other. And a lot of that has to do with their ethnic backgrounds as well. And most people during this time period really did think that if you didn't have some version of religion, that you might not be as moral as somebody who didn't believe in God might be. So being an atheist during this time period is kind of a no-go in most places. Most people didn't think that that was a viable option and maybe made you immoral or amoral. And most people, it mentions even people who didn't have strong religious beliefs like Thomas Jefferson or maybe Alexander Hamilton thought that religion was important and it was the foundation of public morality. It doesn't mean that they necessarily followed biblical teaching, were very conservative. Certainly, you know, they'd all read the Bible and thought of it as an important book. And most of them thought that Jesus was an important moral teacher, and they may not believe in miracles because they're Enlightenment kind of guys and they don't necessarily do that. And that's going to vary among founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson probably being the most skeptical of that group. And almost all of them did believe that creation came from God and that God was a benevolent creator. So that is probably pretty common. As far as, do we go to church? Do we memorize scripture? Do we believe God intervenes in our daily lives? Probably not so much among that founding father group. There are some in that group that do, but others don't. All right. Let's see. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson believes that his most important accomplishment is founding the University of Virginia. But one of the things you'll notice about Thomas Jefferson is that he is important in writing lots of different documents that become important in the early part of US history. The book is going to mention discussion of, in the notes on the state of Virginia, he talks about all kinds of philosophical stuff, but he also mentions stuff that's kind of dumb. I don't know if you should quote me on that one, but he'll talk about why racial and ethnic differences occur. And I know that Thomas Jefferson is generally brilliant, but you know, he's a man of his time with some of his beliefs about race and ethnicity. He is going to suggest something that kind of sounds like evolutionary development or change over time in species and geology, that kind of stuff. He likes to chronicle plants and flora and fauna, animals, that sort of stuff in the notes on Virginia. So, but he also likes to talk about political stuff. Oh, no problem. Other things that he writes about: separation of church and state. He talks about how there should be a wall of separation. He doesn't necessarily call it separation of church and state, but a wall of separation between these two entities. In certain colonies, it still happens, states, excuse me, still happen in Massachusetts and Connecticut, which is like the more conservative version of Massachusetts. In certain, well, it happened in Virginia as well. People paid taxes, and those taxes helped pay for the local minister. So there was not necessarily a wall of separation between church and state. And sometimes there were religious requirements to run for office. So at that, in the discussion of the religious freedom, most famously in the bill for establishing religious freedom in Virginia, There's a discussion about how that combination of church and state would lead to tyranny, and because God has created all men to want to be free, that tyranny doesn't make good sense. Jefferson's going to think of the bill for establishing religious freedom, the idea of that wall of separation between church and state, as one of his most important accomplishments. That, along with founding the university that I mentioned, the University of Virginia, and Declaration of Independence. And he might be right about those things. And the one, it's funny too, because later on when he lists his greatest accomplishments, he doesn't list his presidencies. He had 2 of those, or the Louisiana Purchase. So interesting. But it tells you also that he is primarily a philosophical fellow. So he thinks that these more philosophical ideas that he established are the things that matter long term. But religious liberty should allow people to have a private realm where they keep their religion, and religion should not be supported by the state. So he was really opposed to the idea of the government allowing for taxes. I'm sorry, I couldn't remember when we ended class, so I was looking. He was really opposed to the idea of the government using taxation to support ministers. He was very opposed to that. And you'll see most states adopt those ideas. And certainly when we get to the Constitution, we definitely adopt those ideas. The book is going to also talk about which different churches were more or less likely to support the revolution, and which are more or less likely to be considered American. One of the things that you'll notice is guys like Samuel Adams, Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams, will talk about how the United States will become a Christian Sparta, where Christianity and personal self-discipline lead to progress within the United States. And the reference to Sparta is this idea, and again, I'm not a world historian, but some of you go like, that was my favorite class. I remember about Sparta. Everybody had an obligation to military service, to political service in Sparta. So he's saying that the United States would be like that, only even better with the Christian background. And again, in this era, almost everybody had some version of Christian beliefs. They did. And some of those Christian beliefs led them to the idea that slavery was bad and that public school was good. And that with that public school, that led to knowledge that would keep you free. And that without knowledge, without education, you could not be free and independent, that ignorance leads to slavery and education leads to freedom. And these kind of come out of this idea of Christian republicanism, which I know in the modern era, and republicanism, not political party, but establishment of a republic, like that sort of thing. I know that sometimes this combination of church and state can make us a little nervous, and understandably so. But I'm so sorry. It does lead to some positive things as well. I know I typically have students that go like, church is the most terrible institution in history. It's like, maybe not. I know you're thinking Holy Roman Empire, and I know. But in the modern era, oftentimes the church leads to progress that you like. I know sometimes it doesn't. I know. And the book goes into the different denominations in which, again, more likely to be established. It mentions Anglicans, Presbyterians, Congregationalists. Congregationalists are the extension of Puritans. And then there are going to be different versions of Baptists who rise up, Universalists, that Unitarians. Those are folks that think that you can find truth claims from all different religious backgrounds. And those guys are sometimes seen as a little sketchy during this time period. There are also people who are Jewish who live in the United States during this time period, or the United States during this time period. There might occasionally be somebody who's Buddhist or Muslim, but it's going to be very, very unusual. Okay. All right. Economic freedom would mean being able to be paid wages and potentially, gain an apprenticeship and own land. So, indentured servants, you see indentured servitude kind of working its way out of American society during this era because it's seen as such a limit on freedom, and it's being replaced with apprenticeship, which is where you serve with some, it's kind of similar, only there's certainly enforcement of how you're treated. There's expectations of you maybe not being paid as an employee, but being treated well. So an apprenticeship would be when you go reside with someone else and they teach you your trade, or they teach you their trade. So the bonus for you, it's an apprenticeship. I mean, it's like an apprenticeship nowadays. It's like college. You're learning how to do something. The bonus for them is they get, free work while you learn how to do it. So it's sort of like indentured servitude, except, it's seen as very respectable, and there are laws that govern how you can be treated, and those laws tend to be enforced. So the slightly different kind of thing, perhaps. Let's see. Jefferson, Adams, public education, they both thought, and most founding fathers did, that education was essential to keep a free republic, that if the people in the republic weren't educated, then they weren't going to remain free, and that anybody could convince them of anything if they weren't educated, alert, adept at critical thinking, that sort of thing. Let's see. Adams and land ownership. I wonder why I put that in there. Certainly Adams thought it'd be cool if you own land. But he's going to be of that school that doesn't think that land ownership is crucial for voting rights. But it is harder, of course, to gain economic freedom, wealth, if you don't own land. So that's an issue as well. Let's see. And I know we got to stop pretty soon, although we still have a little bit of time. We're still good. Also, they're going to bring up Adam Smith again in this chapter, our favorite economist. And Adam Smith is going to discuss something called the wealth of nations. It's going to be something, you could read that if you wanted. No, probably not. Where he is going to talk about the invisible hand of the free market directing economic life. So this is where we establish the idea of capitalism, which we certainly love in the United States, and the idea of unregulated capitalism during that time period, the idea that the government should stay out of the economy and the economy should just regulate itself. There you go. Unregulated capitalism. And I think in an era where I'm trying to figure out who's a little noisy. So if I just muted you, it's because I think you're the noisy person. Unregulated capitalism isn't seen as so terrible in this era because of a couple things. One, they don't have factories. And two, they're in the process of eliminating indentured servitude. So they really think that the market should dictate free trade, and free trade is what will lead to economic expansion during this time period. The book is also going to mention that inflation is an issue in this era because they have changed over from using British currency to American currency, continental, that sort of thing. And that is difficult because no one's really established its value. It's not backed up by something wealthy and powerful, that sort of thing. So the economy is a little iffy during this time period. And you know, if you've studied any history at all, that we get a little strange when our economy is bad. We don't always make our best decisions and we don't always treat each other well. The book is also going to talk about what to do with colonial loyalists, people who thought that we should not have left England or Great Britain. There are going to be a handful of those pretty much in any colony. In some of the less populated colonies, they're going to live in the country. So they're probably going to live not very close to the major cities. And sometimes those folks were still going to keep a relationship with people back in England, especially if they could do it in a more distant way from a city where they weren't going to be harassed. If you were a loyalist within cities, you were probably going to get harassed. And if you were a loyalist that got harassed quite a bit, you were probably going to move to Canada if you could. So let's see. The different ethnic groups also probably sided with England or not with England based on their group's background with England. So, peeking at people who we're talking about, the section where it talks about colonial loyalists. So it says loyalist ethnic minorities like Highland Scots in North Carolina feared that local majorities would infringe on their freedom to enjoy cultural autonomy. They would harass them, they wouldn't leave them alone. And usually, the more rural you were, the more you got left alone. Yeah. That's a theme in the Ozarks where I am from. But loyalists who were poorly treated, who had re-education, who maybe had their property stripped from them, if they saw that coming, they probably got out of town. And by getting out of town, Canada is the closest place. If you had money, you might go back to England. But if you were poor, you were probably staying in the city and getting harassed. That's because you didn't have too much option. All right. And after the revolution, there's going to be a fight over who controls the border property, and states will really struggle with that. And states will also try to negotiate with Native American tribes who live on their borders, because there's really not a national government to speak of. I know that there is a national government. We'll talk more about that as we talk about Chapter 7, but it's not a very strong one on purpose. So states, if your state has more money and your state has a larger militia, then you are probably going to be able to negotiate a different sort of deal with the Native Americans on your border, maybe take over some of their land, maybe trade with them, kind of depends on the strength of your state. And as we move toward the Constitution, the states that are growing in power are going to be less likely to want to cede some of that power when they get to the discussions in the Constitution. As far as the Revolution and slavery, it's tricky stuff, because certainly people who understood the concepts of liberty and natural rights, whether they were Black, white, slave, or free, understood that this is the foundation of the American Revolution. And it seems fairly hypocritical for a country that believes in natural rights and freedom to own people. Yes. So this is an open discussion during this time period. It's not something they went, oh, we never really thought about this. But they did really think about it, and they really talked about it, and they really wrote about it a lot. And there's a section in your book, 239, starting there, where it starts to talk about how even some patriots saw slavery as an obstacle to liberty, and some people saw it as a path to liberty, clearly not for slaves. But, at this point, the book mentions 40% of Virginia's population, more so in Georgia and South Carolina, were slaves. Most founding fathers owned at least one slave at some point in their lives. The most notable exception is John Adams. Some people own lots of slaves. Thomas Jefferson's probably going to be the largest slave owner of the group. Um, and some of these folks are going to argue, especially folks from South Carolina and Georgia, that owning slaves gives people economic autonomy, which leads to general freedom. Now, I realize it doesn't give the slave any economic autonomy, but it's a way to kind of get around maybe an obvious contradiction, or maybe to justify the obvious contradiction. There's certainly going to be Quakers in general are going to be opposed to slavery. You'll see more opposition to slavery in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Oh, sorry for the giant yawn as well, in part because of the religious heritage of Quakers and Puritans, which is different and a little more based on congregational government, autonomy, that sort of thing. So those two religious groups tend to be better about opposing slavery, those two denominations, I guess we should say. And of course, if you're a Quaker and you think that everybody has the inner light or a little bit of God inside of them, then you wouldn't want to own someone else who has that same piece of God within them. So, and I think it's, yeah, with Quakers, I think that's pretty self-evident. All right, I'm probably going to stop here in a minute or two, and we'll take up with a little bit of the discussion of Phyllis Wheatley and Republican motherhood, a little bit more about gender. So it'll kind of help you with the question that's due this week. So if you came in a little bit later, which a couple of you did, you will try to do the women question, try to turn that in this week if you can. Because of a conference I was at and didn't get back until yesterday, I did no grading over the weekend. So I'm thinking Wednesday, Friday will be grading days. Our discussion next time about due dates is going to be twofold. One, do you want to delay the last question, weekly question, and make it due at any point during, like the Monday after spring break? Now, the next question is going to need to be due that Friday. We can't really get behind again. And I know that it wasn't your fault. I know it's just, with this class, we can't extend due dates because the class has a pretty firm end date, So, and my concern, it's not so much about the grades, that I don't have enough grades or anything like that. It's college. I can do that however I like. My concern is more, I'll just say it, that if I don't have an assignment, you're not going to look over the material because that's the way we are. It just is. If I didn't have a due date for my grades, I probably wouldn't turn them in when I turn them in either. So most of us need to have that little bit of accountability to follow through on the assignment. And my concern is if you don't do the assignment, you don't know the stuff, and you're not going to pass the quiz. Okay, back to the two decisions. Decision number one, do you want to extend the due date for question 8 to the Monday after spring break? And that way, some of you who may need a little extra time to catch up and aren't going on the ski vacation or whatever would have that time. And the rest of you can turn it in before. Nobody says you have to turn it in then. And 2, are you still good with the quiz due date being the Friday of spring break? So my concern about extending that is I know you're not going to study over spring break. You might do a weekly question, but you're not going to study. And as far as due dates for Unit 2 for questions 5, 6, 7, and 8 from those chapters, I'm going to be pretty loose. As long as you get them in before we start the next unit, I'm probably going to be okay with when you turn them in. I've had a couple of you emails like, really sorry, please don't take off points. Like, I get it. The only thing is if we are that loose about everything forever, then we never kind of get back in the swing of things, which we need to do. Me too. And again, sorry about the grading being a little slow. Sorry, I should put my face back up there. Sorry about the grading being a little slow. That conference was much more involved than I expected.